Thank you very much. Can you all hear me okay?
Yes.
Good. Thanks for inviting me, and I'm very surprised it's even necessary to debate such a motion. It's so patently obvious to anyone that there has to be some very serious and, in my view, aggressive redistribution of wealth, not just in our society, but examine the world as a whole. Because inequality is brutal, inequality is wrong, inequality is unnecessary, and inequality is grossly wasteful of human resources, of people, and of people's lives. If you think back to long before any of us were born, the great musicians of the 17th, 18th century, there were a very small number of them who wrote great music. They were the ones that managed to get through to some kind of position where they could learn and they had the opportunity to play. Same for the artists, same for the writers. Imagine how much more there would be if everyone had been able to read, everyone had been able to write, everyone had been able to play music. Now we see that as all norms for ourselves. We live in a Western country where there is universal education, where there is very high levels of literacy, and there are many opportunities, many of which I might add are under threat. Most of the world's population do not live in that situation. Most of the world's population are worried about survival and about existence. 1/6 of the world's population are worried about whether they've got anywhere to eat or anywhere to live. And so I think we have to approach it from the point of view, firstly, of a global situation, and then move on to what we can do about it. After African countries achieved their independence in the 1960s, and most of the Asian countries, former colonies that did the same, sometimes slightly before, sometimes later, all had aspirations of giving there's a 5-minute warning. Was it 5 minutes gone? 5 minutes to go?
You have 5 more minutes.
5 more minutes,
Yep.
had aspirations of creating universal education, universal health service, and all the things that we take for granted. Some have achieved great things, many have not. Many have received loans at penniless levels of interest, and many of them have been accompanied by advisors from the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund that have said to them, the important thing, you know, is to privatise your services. The important thing is to create an aspirant middle class. The important thing is to hand your land and your agricultural resources over to capital from somewhere else. That leads to great flows of people from rural to urban environments. That leads to shanty towns around major cities. We then have the wars for resources, which are part of the inequality of the world as well. And we then have the ultimate victims of all that, are the 3,000 people that have died in the Mediterranean this year alone, trying to escape from all of that, and the disgusting approach of the European Union and the British government towards people that are threatened with drowning at the very moment as we speak. Then, in that global sense, one has to look at the levels of inequality and the power of a small number of global corporations that have massive power, massively greater power than any one national government. There are a number of corporations that are far more powerful than any national government, even European governments. And so we have to say, well, what can we do about it? We live in Britain, and we were once a very powerful empire. We are no longer an empire, thank goodness, and I hope we can become a force for good rather than a force for bad in the world. This is why I've spent the last 30 years of my life in Parliament opposing wars and intervention and looking for something rather different. But we have to then look at what we can achieve within our own society. I grew up with the certainty of a national health service. I have never worried in my life about health care. Worry about health, maybe, not health care. Will the same be so for any of you when you reach my age? Or will our National Health Service have been destroyed, privatised and sold on? Will it become a pay-as-you-go service rather than a National Health Service? Because the post-war consensus depended on a number of things. One was high taxation, 2 was universal education, 3 was housing, 4 was health. The tax rate at the end of the Second World War for the highest level was over 90%. we now get squeals and squeals and squeals from financial press and banks and so on for the very modest proposal of suggesting that the highest taxation rate should be 50 pence or 50% of income. I would argue that taxation can be a vehicle for redistribution of wealth, can be a way of giving opportunity to people. It can be a very big step forward in protecting and developing our national services. Since 2010, when we had the banking crisis of 2008-2009, brought about not by government profligacy, brought about by government inaction in sufficiently controlling what banks do, and brought about by global inaction on what the world's financial markets and so on were doing, we've had not just an austerity budget of 2010 to pay for the debts that had been accumulated, but we've had a political direction of redistribution of wealth and power in the other direction. Why did that first emergency budget of June 2010 specifically target the Department of Work and Pensions budget and hit everyone's benefits? Why are we now having desperate poverty, food banks, people sleeping on the streets, and a benefit cap that is socially cleansing communities such as I represent, because it doesn't go anywhere near meeting the rental demands of the private rented sector? So I say, I want to live in a civilised society, I want to live in a decent society, I want to live in a more equal society. If you're rich, pay your tax. If you're a global corporation, don't dodge your tax. Pay it as an act of social responsibility, so that we can develop the services we want and unlock the amazing potential of so many people denied the chance to achieve their all because of the poverty in which they live. Inequality is brutal, wasteful, nasty and wrong. Let's aggressively redistribute wealth so we all benefit from the genius of engineers, scientists and all the others that have done so much for this planet. So open your eyes, open your mind, and think of what the world could be like, not the arid world of inequality and poverty and the aggression against those that are victims of poverty. Please support the motion. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Corbyn. If anyone is interested in tweeting about the debate, the hashtag is #WDU Redistribution. And now, Mr. Liam Halligan.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls. Thank you, Jeremy. It's good to be back. I graduated from Warwick in 1991. I was the first person in my family to go to university. I know all about the benefits of redistribution. My family's benefited from it. My father was an immigrant from the west of Ireland. But what I don't want is aggressive redistribution, because whenever policy is aggressive and venal and chippy and bitter, it becomes bad policy, and it prevents enterprise, it stymies business, and it's actually anti-meritocratic. I've got a confession to make. I do want redistribution. I want redistribution so much I'm even going to take my tie off so I look like the other side of the with their fat-faced chinos and their funny shoes. I'm not a bad guy just because I don't believe in aggressive redistribution, because I don't believe in an overbearing state. I've got a confession to make though. Owen, injury time. I'm an economist. We haven't got the charisma to be accountants, we haven't got the imagination to be engineers. I remember stumbling around the union trying to come up with, you know, economically relevant chat-up lines like, you raised my interest rate. With no corresponding reduction in the feel-good factor. Further stimulus will lead to an uncontrolled expansion. I'm on for late at night. If we go back to my room in Tossal, can I drop my assumptions? So here I am, an economist. I do believe in redistribution. I want redistribution. But there's a huge amount of redistribution already. I'm going to focus my comments on the UK, but just on the world. Yes, of course, there's a lot of inequality in the world. Of course there is. But there's far less inequality across the world than there was when I was at Warwick. Why? Not because I left Warwick, no. It's because we've had governments getting out of the way and letting enterprise rescue people. We've had governments, overbearing governments, imposing things like food famine and corrupt governments, getting out of the way, freeing up societies, allowing people's natural entrepreneurial ability to come out. Here in the UK, we have taxation in this country that's 45% of GDP. 45% of GDP, and yet the politicians are so fiscally incontinent, they can't stop themselves spending 50% of GDP. That's why we've had a budget deficit of 5% of GDP for the last 7 years. That's why, Jeremy, for all your austerity that you talk about, and no one's saying that there's not poverty in certain parts of the UK, of course there is, of course there is. But for the austerity you talk about, the national debt in this country, ladies and gentlemen, since 2008 has increased from £820 billion to £1,500 billion. It's doubled. Osborne's borrowed more in 5 years than Brown did in 10. Austerity is a myth, not for individual people, but across the whole of the macro strata. UK is living well beyond its means. It's insane. The Bank of England owns a third of all outstanding gilts. You guys will pay. Not him, not me. You guys will pay. And more aggressive redistribution with a government trying to clamp down on people just because it thinks it will get a good headline is not the way to go. It will lead to a government that's even more out of control. You double the national debt in 5 years and then you tell the population it's austerity. That's disgusting, and yet that is what we're seeing. It's immoral that we're leaving these debts, my generation, Jeremy's generation, to you, because you're going to live in a much more competitive world than we did. And that, I don't want to see that. Big, aggressive redistribution leads to inefficiency. Look at France under Hollande. France has grown at an average of 0.2% for the past 4 years. Hollande's 75% wealth tax is a joke. The president and his Prime Minister had to come to London to remind everybody that don't worry, it will be gone in a year. It was all about class war and envy. That's not the way to run a country. When I was growing up in the UK, my father came over from Ireland. He tried desperately to be his own man, to run a business, to employ people. Time and again, he was almost put out of business by taxation. You had a 98% super tax. That's insane. You got a 75% wealth tax in France as well. How can that possibly be the right thing to do? The UK back then ended up going cap in hand to the IMF. It was our economic Suez. We had to be bailed out by America. Absolutely crazy. And that's where rapacious, aggressive redistribution got us. Don't tell me I don't want the NHS just because I don't want aggressive redistribution. Of course I want the NHS. Many members of my family came over from Ireland and helped to run the NHS. Don't scare me that there's not going to be any health care unless the government spends 50% of GDP. The state needs to do less, ladies and gentlemen, but do it better. I've made many documentaries from Dispatches, Channel 4 News and so on about waste, massive waste in the health system. It's absolutely outrageous. Swathes of middle management, huge legal fees, a culture of fear if anybody tries to point out that there is waste, and especially if they talk to journalists about it. I went to tribunals trying to get nurses their jobs back because they had spoken out about waste in the NHS. You don't have to just endlessly have more money in order to get a better health system. I passionately believe in free at the point of use, but aggressive redistribution, clamping down on enterprise, is not the way to guarantee free at the point of use healthcare, whatever Mr. Corbyn and his Labour backbench friends will tell you. Of course, I want to see benefits for people who deserve them and who need them. That's part of a civilised society. My family's benefited from them in the past. But so much of housing welfare spending, ladies and gentlemen, goes on housing benefit. Why is housing benefit so high? Because we're not building enough houses. So we end up giving 20, 30, 40 billion pounds a year to private landlords. That's crazy. That doesn't mean you have to tax people more and more and more. It means you have to build more houses. We built 115,000 houses in this country last year. That's the post-war low. We need at least 250,000 houses a year just to meet our own demography before we welcome people from around the world as my family was welcome. The idea isn't, the solution isn't just to tax more and more. You need to sort out the actual problem, and at its heart, a lot of the welfare problem is about housing benefit, and housing benefit is so high, the total bill, because private landlords set rents that are so high because there are too few houses. Now, you think you might want aggressive redistribution because you don't like bankers. I don't like bankers either. There is no newspaper columnist in this country, probably in Europe, who has railed against the banking sector more than me. And the Telegraph's let me do it. I want Glass-Steagall bank reform. I want a split between commercial and investment banks. I want bankers that broke the law, and there are many, to go to jail, and yet they don't, because Mr. Corbyn's party, in cahoots with the Tories, are getting there's too much closeness between our financial services industry and Labour under Blair, as you know, Mr. Corbyn, and the Tories. The idea, if you want to solve our banking problems, have genuine bank reform. I agree with Jeremy on that. That was part of the problem, why we got into this fiscal mess that we're now in. Another part of the problem was that during years of big growth and massive revenue, Gordon Brown spent far too much money. And I think anybody objectively looking at the situation would agree with that. Now, it seems to me, in sum, that the problem isn't inequality. Yes, there's inequality. Inequality around the world is falling very quickly because of growth around the world, because the emerging markets are opening up, and because communism was smashed, thankfully, in Eastern Europe. I assume you were in favour of that. The problem that you have to deal with is social mobility. This country was far more socially mobile when I was your age than it is now. It's much harder to tackle social mobility than it is to just keep hiking taxes on people who are apparently rich. Is it really right that a couple struggling to get together a £45,000, £50,000 annual take-home pay for themselves are taxed at the top rate? Is that really fair? Are they really rich? Maybe some of your parents are in that category. Of course they're not rich. That's outrageous that they're being taxed at 45%, and then with national insurance on top of that. So the last thing I'll say is that if you believe in aggressive redistribution of tax, you don't understand enterprise, you don't understand business, you're going to the lowest common denominator. It's okay to have a picture of Che Guevara on your bedroom wall when you're a student, but not when you're in the real world. Thank you.
Professor Swift.
Thank you. Yeah, well, this side believes in fair use of time as well as everything else. Okay, so and we've won. He took his tie off. We've won, right? In effect.
Address the argument.
I'm with Jeremy. There are ways in which inequality is obviously bad, and Nick is going to talk about those later, right? And I think everybody agrees that there are obvious ways in which it's bad. That doesn't mean it's not justified or defensible, right? There are some really bad things that are justified or defensible. I watched The Apprentice for the first time last week. I could not believe what rubbish it was that my fellow Brits were watching. I bought some crisps, literally just now. I thought they were cheese and onion. They were cheesy beans on toast crisps. Right? They were terrible, bad things, but they're justified and defensible. We can go into the arguments about what they have to do now. Now, we've got to look at whether there are any good arguments for existing levels of wealth inequality. That's what we're looking for, right? Because our side is proposing that there should be redistribution, and we're looking for reasons why we should not redistribute. Okay, and I can think of four. And what happens is that defenders of existing inequality slide between these four different claims. Okay, so the first is something to do with freedom, right? And we had a suggestion of that of an interfering state. The state is interfering with individual freedom. It's true. Were we to redistribute wealth aggressively or otherwise, we would be interfering with people's freedom. We'd be interfering with their freedom to keep hold of the wealth they currently have. There is a specific freedom they wouldn't have. Now we have to think, is it really important that people have that freedom? Is it like freedom of religion? Is it like freedom of sexuality? It would be terrible if the state started interfering with people's freedom of religion or sexuality, but the freedom to keep hold of the wealth you currently have is not a similar freedom. Of course, we also have to think about the freedom of those who haven't got the wealth. Now, some people at this point would start to talk about a difference between negative freedom, being free from interference, and positive freedom, being free to do things, which clearly those who lack resources don't have the same freedom to do things as those who have the wealth, right? But in fact, we don't need to think about positive freedom or negative freedom. The kind of freedom that the poor lack is exactly the same kind of freedom that the wealthy are worried about losing. Is the freedom not to be interfered with in doing what you want. Because if you're poor, you will be interfered with when you try and do what you want all the time. You try and go and get a meal. You try and get from one country to another. You will be stopped, and that will be an interference with your freedom in the pure negative sense, exactly the same kind that the free marketeers are claiming we need to respect if we respect wealth inequalities. Okay, so freedom doesn't work. What's really happening here is a claim that the wealthy have a right to their wealth. And if that were true, that would be a really good reason not to redistribute it. Okay, so is there a right for the wealthy to retain their wealth? I can think of two main reasons why there might be. One would be that they deserve it. Right, that the wealthy deserve their wealth, so justice requires that we respect their desert claim to the wealth that they hold. Notice one implication of this would be that the poor deserve to be poor. Right? If the idea is that existing wealth inequalities are justified on the grounds that they reflect different desert, then that means that the poor deserve to be poor. And that seems horrific as a claim to me. Now, Friedrich Hayek, the best argument, I think, for defending wealth inequalities and market outcomes, he clearly saw and explicitly said that it was absurd to think that the market gave people what they deserved. Hayek did not defend inequalities on the grounds that they reflect desert. He said it's a very convenient myth that people think they do, and he was worried about what would happen if it became known widely that the market rewards much more than anything else luck. It rewards the luck of what talent you happen to have and the luck of what talents are what it is that other people are willing to pay you to do. Okay? So the best arguments for the right don't appeal to desert. Another reason why you might think that people have a right to the wealth they currently have is that they're entitled to it. Okay, they don't deserve it, there's too much luck involved, but nonetheless they're entitled to it because, let's say, it reflects their choices over what they want to do with their bodies. They own their bodies, and if people choose to give them resources in return for what they choose to do in the workplace or in other ways, then that's fine, and we have to respect those voluntary transfers. Now that looks like it might be a good argument. It might be a good argument if you thought people really did own the talents that they can deploy in the labour market. And some very, very thoughtful libertarian philosophers have argued that. It seems to me implausible to think that people own their talents in such a way that they can deploy them in this way without thinking about their use of the world that belongs to all of us. Right? People don't just use their own talents, even if you think they do own them. They also interact with the world to make stuff. And the world, in my view, is not, as it currently is, privately owned by people. It's available as a resource and should be a resource to all of us. So I'm quite keen on something that gets called left libertarianism, which combines the idea that we own ourselves, but we recognise that we also have an equal share of the world that we happen to have been born into. And a left libertarian would support aggressive redistribution of wealth from existing wealth levels, which clearly don't reflect simply the deployment of talents. Okay, so the best argument and the only real argument for existing wealth inequalities does not claim that the wealthy have a right to their current wealth levels, and therefore we'd be violating a right of theirs if we took some of it from them. That's not the argument. The best argument isn't that they have a right to it. The best argument is that it's economically efficient or productive to allow existing wealth levels, and that's implicitly what Liam Halligan was suggesting when he talked about the Soviet Union, the communist bloc, and so on. And I think we're now in the right territory, right? We're not in the territory that the rich deserve it or that they don't have any justice claim to it. It's simply that it's an efficient way to organise an economy. So let's ask, does it look as if the way we are organising our own economy and the world's economy at the moment is in fact an efficient way of organising it? Where efficient to me must mean really helping everybody, and especially helping the worst off. Not the worst off in 100 years' time, the worst off now. Does it look as if we've got things right in that wealth inequalities as they currently are just at the right level? Right? It seems to me absurd to think that that's the case. It seems to me clear that aggressive redistribution of wealth from current wealth levels would be justified. And remember, and I'm finishing, I've seen a zero, so I'm going to stop, right? The reason why we're redistributing is not for equality. It's not for equality, okay? We're not trying to produce a more equal outcome. What we're trying to do is help the badly off. And the world, and even the UK, is full of very badly off people. And the idea that we should resist redistributing wealth to them to make their lives better seems to me indefensible. So this is a bad thing, and there are no good arguments for it. So I urge you to go vote for the motion. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Swift. And now, Dr. David Middleton.
Notice a certain aura of charisma about me, it's because I am an accountant. I always like to say that to distinguish myself from economists. And I would like to congratulate our opponents because they've done what Sir Humphrey would call a very brave thing. They've chosen to talk about aggressive redistribution of wealth. And of course, in theory, redistributing wealth is more comprehensive than redistributing income. But I'm going to talk about two aspects of that. One is practical problems of wealth taxes, and Mr. Corbyn was waxing eloquent about how awful the world is and how he and his pals could make it better. But he never really came down to earth and explained how it would actually work. So talking about practical problems is worth doing. And the second one I'm going to talk about is the purpose of wealth taxes. The first problem with taxing wealth is a fairly obvious one. How do you value it? But it's not an easy problem. I mean, if you just look at a recent proposition that clearly hasn't been properly thought through, the so-called mansion tax, that is a version of a tax on wealth. But no one has worked out how it's actually going to operate. And even Labour councils are now apparently voting against having a mansion tax in the first place. But we have to remember that property of the sort that a mansion tax might involve is the easiest kind of asset of all to value. That's the easy one. It's noticeable, by the way, that when you think about council tax, governments always run away from revaluing properties for the purpose of council tax. Why is that? Because they know it would cause an awful lot of hassle, an awful lot of guesswork, an awful lot of unfairness. They don't even have the nerve to add a couple of bands on the top of the existing bands, which one would have thought is perfectly practicable and would achieve some real political objectives. But it's too difficult and too practically tricky. But other forms of property are much, much harder to value. For example, pictures, furniture, coins, stamps. When my parents went abroad, they were only allowed at that time, thanks to exchange controls, to take £4,000 with them to last them 4 years. That was a long time ago, and currency debasement has done its work, so that £4,000 would probably be about, I don't know, 30 or 40,000 today. But it was a ridiculous amount to expect people to live on for 4 years. Luckily, they had some assets that they were able to simply transfer by car, which weren't even spotted, so that, if you like, was a form of exchange control avoidance, a thoroughly worthwhile activity. But valuing the assets they took would have been very difficult. What about accrued pension rights? If we're going to tax people's wealth, we want to add up the wealth correctly. And for many people, pension rights is one of the biggest parts of their wealth. But how do you value it? I mean, just take one technical point, what discount rate do you use? I have a horrid feeling, maybe unjustified, but a horrid feeling our opponents haven't even thought of that question, let alone begin to provide an answer. They are very impractical people. What, by the way, if you don't have liquid funds? Asset rich, cash poor. You've probably heard that phrase. What if you don't have liquid funds? How are you going to pay an aggressive wealth tax? The two capital taxes we have at the moment solve that problem reasonably well. Inheritance tax is only incurred on death, and it does seem to me that death is a not unreasonable moment to require people or their heirs to revalue assets and, if necessary, sell some of them to pay the tax. That's an obvious moment at which it's less inconvenient than at any other time. And capital gains tax, of course, is payable only on realisation. If you have a portfolio of shares, you don't pay tax on the amount it increases in value every year, because even value in shares has its own technical problems. What you do is wait until you sell your shares, maybe at a profit, and then you can be expected, with the cash, or part of the cash, to pay the tax. So that works quite well. By the way, any decent capital gains tax surely needs to allow for inflation. Otherwise, you're taxing totally unreal gains. At one time, our tax did allow for inflation, but it no longer does, I'm afraid. Inflation is quite a problem in our society. For example, during my lifetime, the pound has lost 98% of its purchasing power. If you'll forgive an accounting joke, only 2% now to go. The point I want to make, though, is that capital taxes raise very little money. Inheritance tax and capital gains tax between them raise about 1% of the total tax revenue. So even if you do have some wealth taxes, they are not going to solve the problem of the world's poor. And that brings me to the key question, what is the purpose of our wealth tax? Basically, is it to help the poor or hurt the rich? If you want to help the poor, there's no doubt, all the evidence shows, the best way to do that is economic growth. And it's thanks to the wonders of the Industrial Revolution, which left this country the richest country in the world for many, many years, that our average standard of living in this country now is about 10 times as high in real terms as it was 150 years ago. That's economic growth. And as a result, poor people have gained enormously, not through redistribution, through growth. The top rate of income tax, by the way, has been over 90% for more than half my life. It wasn't just a modest post-war thing in the Attlee government. It was a lot longer than that. And increasing the top income tax rate a few years ago to 50% probably actually reduced total tax revenue. But funnily enough, the people who introduced it didn't really mind. They were out to hurt the rich. They didn't in the least care about the poor, some of whose taxes had to go to make up the revenue shortfall resulting from that political trickery. But if your purpose is nothing to do with helping the poor, you might be attracted by a novel by L.P. Hartley called Facial Justice. In that book, his imaginary government had the charming idea of deliberately uglifying handsome boys and girls to produce more equality, or as I prefer to call it, difference. If you say inequality is wicked, you're saying difference is wicked. And I think that's a very foolish sentiment. I call that the moral low ground. But it might appeal to those whose idea of fairness is based on envy. I have a feeling the Green Party might be advocates. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Middleton, and now Nick Jordan.
Thank you very much. Thanks for inviting me. It's a bit of a weird motion in some ways because I do support a radical redistribution of wealth. But actually, there's already a radical redistribution of wealth going on that I certainly don't support. There is an aggressive, very aggressive redistribution of wealth going on in our world today, and I want to give you some figures to show that. In January this year, Oxfam did some work. They were looking at 2013 figures of wealth, and they found that the 85 richest people in the world had the same amount of wealth as the 3.5 billion poorest people. 85 people, 3.5 billion people. So that's the bottom half of the world's population. Now in March, someone from Forbes magazine was very interested in this, and she re-examined the figures, because they produced them more often than they did in 2013, so they'd already produced some by the beginning of 2014. And she found it had changed in that short time. Now, only 67 people had the same amount of wealth as the bottom half of the world's population. So, and by the time she finished the article and it was published and up on the website, they had to change it again, because now only 66 people had the same amount of wealth as the bottom half of the world's population. So this is inequality at absolutely crazy levels. This is the most aggressive redistribution of wealth that we've seen in history. Certainly far, far, far greater than we saw in any communist countries. Whatever you think of those countries, simply isn't true that communist countries were more unequal. Now, most people will be naturally stunned by those figures, I think. But if you're not stunned by those figures, and you still need an argument as to why we have a problem in the world, I'm going to give you 4 arguments. First of all, that inequality is incompatible with eradicating poverty. It's incompatible with democracy. It's incompatible with a happy society. And it's incompatible with basic notions of justice. Let's start off with poverty. There's been a big push over the last 30 years. And some aid organisations are responsible for playing a role in this, but so are celebrities like Bono. They put a lot of time into trying to turn poverty into a non-political issue. And they've tried to do this because there's a hegemony of right-wing thought in political elites in the West. And they try to make poverty alleviation palatable to those right-wing elites. And so they've turned it into a kind of technical, mathematical equation. They tried to say that you can be both intensely relaxed about people getting filthy rich, as Peter Mandelson said 15 years ago, and also care about the very poor getting less poor. You can be both of those things. You don't need to question, if you're well off, how your life might be interacting with the facts that people are experiencing when they're in poverty. You can do both things. You can enjoy your wealth and also fight poverty. The problem is it isn't true. It's an extremely narrow definition of poverty, which is incomplete, because poverty isn't about whether you live on $1 a day or not. Poverty stems from a lack of ability to access your rights that comes from a lack of access to the resources you need to lead a decent life. Poverty is about a lack of power. And that lack of power is a direct consequence of other people having too much power because they control the resources of the world. And that control of resources of the world is getting worse and worse. The concentration of wealth and control is getting worse and worse. The idea that growth simply leads to alleviating poverty is so absurd that we shouldn't even be discussing it. In Africa, where the financial press at the moment would have you believe there was some kind of miracle going on because growth rates are taking off and so on, you're finding in many countries, from Mozambique to Nigeria, that poverty rates are also going up. Growth is going up fast, and poverty is going up. So you're seeing an incredibly unequal economic model being implemented in Angola, an extremely poor country with a lot of natural resources. Luanda is the most expensive city on earth, while half of the population live in poverty. I mean, how can... We heard about the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution caused many, many people in this country to live in some of the worst misery that's ever been inflicted on anyone on the face of this earth, labouring away in satanic mills in this area and further north. And it was nothing to do with growth that made ordinary people richer. It was to do with the fact that people fought. They fought for an aggressive and radical redistribution of income. And that's how most of us are sitting here in this room today. That's how I have an education. That's how we have a health service. People fought for a radical, aggressive redistribution of income. Even the Liberal government in the early 1900s said it wanted to tax the rich till the pits squeak. That was a Liberal Prime Minister, Chancellor of the Exchequer, who said that. I'm going to have to move on really quickly because I could spend ages on poverty. Secondly, though, is democracy. Wealth confers power. You know, the rich aren't accumulating kind of Christmas baubles that don't make any difference to anybody else. They're accumulating power, and they exercise that power in a self-interested way. Not a surprise. But what that means is that in very unequal countries, political space becomes smaller and smaller and smaller, and more people become alienated from the political process. In America, for example, it's pretty easy just to buy candidates and buy parties. I mean, in an African country, we'd call that corruption, but it's legalised, and it's getting worse. Even in this country, the political parties don't represent the diversity of views there are in this country. They certainly don't represent the interests of the majority of people in this country. Why are people turning to slightly lunatic parties like UKIP? Because they see nothing in the mainstream political establishment that represents them. And that's because democracy has been closed down. It's become an elite club. Even groups like Credit Suisse and so on, which published a report last week that found the richest 1% globally own about 48% of global wealth. The richest 1%, 48% of global wealth. So this is a really worrying signal, and it's not sustainable, and you know it's going to drive us into recession again. So even like and same things that come out from the IMF and the World Bank and people I really normally disagree with. But even it's got to the extreme where even they are worried that the system is eating itself. It's so serious. So it's closing down our democratic space to argue for alternatives. And I haven't even begun to talk about access to justice and so on. I mean, surely nobody really thinks that your access to justice has nothing to do with your wealth. I mean, you only need to look in our society at the way the crimes of the poor are dealt with compared to the way the crimes of the rich are dealt with, as you can see in the financial crisis. I've got very little time. Inequality makes people unhappy. This was a lot of work done by Richard Wilkinson in the Spirit level, where he found not a small link, a very, very, very strong link between inequality and life expectancy, mental illness, teen birth rates, violence, percentage of the populations in prison, drug use, unmanageable debt, not like 20% higher, many, many times higher from things that are socially undesirable. I haven't got time to talk about my last point, but maybe we can talk about it in the questions. But I'm just going to end by saying that it seems that in an unequal world, the richest, and we've seen this in the financial crisis in recent years, the richest can bring the world to its knees, yet it's the other half of the world, the other 3/4, the other 90 or 99% of the world who bear the consequences. And that cannot be right, just, fair, compatible with democracy or anything else that we hold dear.
Thank you to Mr. Dearden, and now Dr. Stephen Davis.
Can you hear me at the back without the mic, or would you rather I use mine? Good, okay. Well, glad to be here, and I'm afraid I've got quite a few things, obviously, where I would like to disagree with the people on the other side here. Basically, they've done two things. The first is that they've conflated two issues which are actually distinct. One is which is poverty and inequality, and the other is that, despite what Graham in particular said, there are indeed serious liberty issues associated with questions about the radical and aggressive redistribution of wealth in society. There's also, I would argue, profound questions which are skated around and avoided when you start to talk about redistribution, not least the question of what the unit within which the redistribution is supposed to take place should be, and on what criteria it's meant to be used. And these mean that I think when you examine it, that the concepts are incoherent. Now, the first point I would make is that the real problem we should be concerned about in the world, or indeed in this country, is not inequality as such, it's poverty. And I agree with a lot of the sentiments that we've heard from the other side. Poverty is undoubtedly, on a whole number of grounds, a bad thing. Now, if you look at the world now and compare it to the world of 1820, for example, there has been an amazing and enormous improvement. In 1820, according to the World Bank's own sort of estimates, 80% of the world's population was then living on the then equivalent of $1.25 a day, which is their official line for abject poverty. The proportion living in that basis now is around 15%, so there's been a dramatic decline over the last 200 years nearly. A large part of which, by the way, has taken place in the last 15 to 20 years, during the era of globalization. Now, you heard about Africa. Most of those figures in Africa are actually due to the resource curse effects in Nigeria and Angola, which I agree are highly problematic. On the other hand, what you've had in the last 20 years is an enormous increase in the well-being of hundreds of millions of people in India and China. And this is not due to redistribution, it's due, in fact, to economic growth. And to argue that economic growth is not going to improve the condition of the least well-off is to fly in the face of absolutely overwhelming evidence. We heard about the Industrial Revolution. The evidence, I'm afraid, is absolutely clear-cut. The conditions of the average person in Britain, real wages, actually increased dramatically between 1790 and 1840, the early phases of industrialisation, when people would have you believe that the conditions of the poor was actually deteriorating. Historians no longer bother to argue about that. The argument is now all about whether or not that rise in incomes was sufficient to compensate for a supposed decline in the quality of life, which was supposed to be involved in moving from the countryside to the city. Even that argument, I think, no longer stands up. Now the question is this: there's only a relevance between inequality and poverty if you believe, A, that the wealth of some is the cause of the poverty of others. That may be true, as I'll come on to in a moment, but as a general principle I would say that is not. And that B, the way to help the poor and to address their condition is by taking money from the wealthy and giving it to them. And as I would just argue, the real way to help the poor is through greater economic growth. Very quickly I would mention a few things that we could do that would greatly help the poor of the world in this country. We could move towards a freer trade. We could get rid of the monstrous policy of agricultural protectionism, which we have in the EU and in the United States. One of the biggest things we could do would be to open our borders and to allow freer migration of people who want to improve their life. And I agree completely with Jeremy, by the way, that the policy of the EU and the British government is disgusting, quite honestly, and morally beyond the pale. So there are all kinds of things we could do like that. What we could do in the UK, above all else, is raise productivity. The great problem we have in this country, really, is, as the current growth in low-paid jobs shows, is that we're becoming a low-productivity economy. And raising labour productivity and increasing the efficiency of the British economy is the best way to help the condition of the many poor people that we sadly still have in this country. Now, moreover, the problem really is this: inequality is not right or wrong per se. The question you need to ask is, where does the inequality come from? Now, some inequalities, as Graham alluded to, arise from voluntary transactions. Wayne Rooney earns an enormous amount, far more than I could ever hope to earn. But he does so because lots of people all around the world, for reasons which escape me, are prepared to pay from there small amounts of money, which add up collectively to an enormous amount, to watch Manchester United play on satellite television. And some part of that flow goes to people like Wayne Rooney. That's a purely voluntary transaction. On the other hand, there are lots of people who are extremely rich, including a large number of the people that you just heard about, who I would say are not justified in what they have. The richest man in the world, by most calculations, is a Mexican chap who basically owns a large telephone company, which he got because of corrupt privatisation manoeuvres. Now, the point, therefore, is not to redistribute it, it's to address the reasons why you have inappropriate or unjust ownership of assets, such as political cronyism and the kind of thing that you have endemically, for example, in Russia and in many other countries, where people have political power and use that political power to enrich themselves. That is not a case, however, for redistributing wealth in general. It's a case for dealing with the kind of things that lead to the bad kinds of inequality and the bad kinds of wealth concentration, which I agree do indeed have bad political effects. The most extreme case historically was Bolivia, where one guy, who later on became Jimmy Goldsmith's father-in-law, against his wishes by the way, owned about 60% of the entire country's GDP. And this was through basically political control of the key industry in the country, the tin mining industry. Now, as I say, the concept also is incoherent. What all of the people on the other side have skirted around is the question of, well, if you're talking about redistribution within what unit? Because Credit Suisse, for example, recently brought out a report upon global wealth inequality, and it made the kind of points that you just heard about how a very small number of people control an amazingly large share of the world's total wealth. But what they also pointed out was that most of the people in this country are in the top 10%. So if you're talking about redistribution, are you talking about it on a global basis, which is what you should be if you're using universal arguments, or are you actually talking about redistribution within this country? And finally, I disagree with Ren. I think liberty issues do arise from moves towards radical or aggressive redistribution. I do think that you own your talents. I think it would be very strange and dangerous to argue you do not, because that implies, in fact, in some sense, the talents that you have are actually disposed of and should be used to benefit other people, regardless of what you want to do with them. And there's a name for that kind of relationship, and it's called strength. And I do not want to live in a world in which ownership of talents or self-direction is not permitted. Thank you.
Davies and Mr. Middleton is also correct. What we're generally taught here is that economic growth-led prosperity increases the overall pie, but disproportionately. So that is, in absolute terms, this approach benefits the poor, in fact, more in absolute income terms, but the negative is that it does also increase the income gap. So the main argument that I heard from you against this is that, yes, that's all well and good with the poor exponential. They're not happy about the fact that there's this income inequality here, but then if they're actually getting richer in absolute terms, have you got any stronger arguments than they're not happy about this increasing inequality?
I mean, well, first of all, I mean, what you're taught in economics, I can't say without seeing the course, but a lot of what people are taught in economics certainly is rubbish. And we need to reclaim economics actually from the idea that it's a science to the idea that it's actually about politics and power.
Marx.
But yes, we definitely need to learn Marx in economics. First of all, no, it's not the case that the poor are getting richer. It absolutely depends how you distribute the rewards of growth. I'm not necessarily against growth. Some countries do need growth. However, it depends how you're distributing it. There are experiments going on in Latin America at the moment, and I'm very much in favour of, where growth is being used to distribute money far more effectively. That's because there is massive state power, there's massive public ownership, there's massive democratisation programs and so on. In that way, growth is being redistributed more equally. But in many, many, many countries in the world, because of this neoliberal ideology we've had so long, that just assumes that it doesn't matter where the growth comes, it will trickle down to the poorest. It isn't trickling down to the poorest. I mean, we've known that's not true for 30 years. It doesn't trickle down to the poorest. The New Economics Foundation did a great study about 10 years ago, where they said for every pound of growth that's created, even in this country, the amount that actually goes to the bottom 50% is absolutely minuscule. So they're not getting rich. That's the first thing. The first thing is I just don't believe they are getting richer. The second thing...
That's before tax, then you have tax.
The second thing, well, yeah,
that's before tax.
Fewer and fewer.
Then you have tax.
Yes, but except you don't want tax.
No, I do. I want a state that's not 45 or 50% of GDP. I want a state that's 35% of GDP.
No, because it's already...
massive debts on these guys, which they can't afford just because we can't control ourselves.
It's not putting debts on the majority of people. And that's the second thing. No, you're putting, the people who want tuition fees are putting debts on these guys, not me. I argued against them. The second thing, you can't deal with poverty by giving people vouchers and so on. It's about control of resources.
They were born with £15,000 per head national debt. They've now got £45,000 per head national debt. No, it isn't meaningless because they don't have to pay it.
But it doesn't matter if what that's doing is redistributing. So the second point which I'll finish on, is that poverty isn't simply about whether people live on $1 a day or not. Like, poverty is relative, because poverty is about how power is distributed in society. So you can't just say, you've got a little bit better and I've got much better, but we're both a bit better off. Because it's just simply not how it works. It's not how people conceive of society. It's all, we live in a set of social relations, and if those social relations are unfair, then power will accumulate in an unfair way, and we need to redress those social relations. That's how you get to the bottom, the bottom of the problem. And that means inequality. You have to deal with it.
Dr. Davis.
Yeah, quickly. Yeah, a couple of points. First of all, actually, I agree with the argument that economics is not a science. We should move away from that. I think it's very much about political economy. And so, essentially, economics as a discipline is about the way you organise the affairs of society in order to reach certain goals collectively in the way that's most efficient in the use of resources. And that's clearly a political process. So I think this idea that it's a neutral science is, I say, a bad idea, which we should kick into touch. So I agree with that. Now, the fact is, economic growth pretty much always raises the incomes of the poor. Of course, there's then a question of how far the incomes of the other people in society, particularly the richest, have gone up. But to say that it's not raising the incomes of the poor at all is simply to fly in the face of empirical evidence, which is simply overwhelming. What you can make an argument for, which would be much more respectable, is that you need to have greater and more equality in the distribution of the productivity gains that basically drive economic growth. Now, that leads to much more interesting and practical questions, such as why is it that, for example, since the 1970s, productivity gains have not been distributed as equally as they were before? What you'll hear from the other side is that's because there's been a decline in redistribution. But actually, I don't think that's the case. It's for other reasons. And the thing to do is to address those other reasons. If what you want is a more equal distribution. That's why I'm quite actually keen on the idea of pre-distribution that Ed Miliband was playing around with a few months ago, changing the institutions or the way things work so that you get a more equal share of productivity gains in the first place, rather than redistribution, which is going to have all kinds of dangerous effects. And by the way, finally, a quick point. People will often point to Scandinavia as a kind of example here. What you may not realise is that our welfare state in Britain is actually more redistributive than Sweden's. The reason why Sweden is a more egalitarian country than Britain is not because they have redistribution, it's because they have a more egalitarian distribution of income in the first place. And that's the kind of thing that you need to think about.
Mr. Halligan. Anyone else? Questions?
Me?
Yeah.
I have a question to Mr. Dargan again. Do you disagree with the fact that hundreds of millions of people were lifted out of poverty in the last 25 years? In China, in India.
In China. In China.
Were lifted out of poverty.
In China. Not by the policies we're talking about, by completely different policies.
Yeah,
that's the thing, all of that gain was made in China.
But you also, you disagree with the fact that economic growth increases the wealth of the poorest people. You disagreed with that. You did exactly that all the time when Mr. Davies and Mr. Middleton did and said that. So can you tell me what exactly is your point to help the poorest people of the societies? I know that the fact that many people in these countries were lifted out of poverty, that means that some of the jobs from the West, for example, were moved down there. But isn't that much more beneficial to the people overall because more people had these jobs? That's just what I would like to, that's just the point I would like to make here.
I don't say that growth can't lift people out of poverty. It doesn't necessarily. That's why I think that's the point. I say if there's growth going on in certain Latin American countries, it's definitely lifting people out of poverty. But it depends how strong the struggle in society is to make sure that wealth actually comes to the majority of people. And unfortunately, in many countries in the world, that doesn't exist. In China, that's completely different. I mean, it wasn't done on that basis at all, and they put things in place around education and healthcare and so on that actually meant that it was fair. Not necessarily redistribution, by the way. I agree with the point about redistribution. But I mean, that means a massive change of power in our society as it is now. You can't just say you don't believe in redistribution from this point. You know, I mean, I agree with you, but like, how are you going to remove the natural advantages in wealth that the entire elite of our society currently get? And as free marketeers, I would have thought that you'd have a massive problem with the amount of inequality.
I'm not saying there should be no redistribution, Nick. I'm saying that when your government is spending half of GDP, it's too much. The rider is heavier than the horse. We have massive redistribution in this country. My fear is that we're now in a situation where politicians haven't got the guts to deal with bankers and stand up to the vested interests, where they haven't got the guts to deal with the people that give them their campaign donations, that the general public is on a false premise being sold the idea that the way to solve our problems is to increase taxation even more and even more and even more. That has massive disbenefits for economic efficiency. It will lead to all kinds of wealth leaving the country. Also, it will lead to a state that becomes rapacious and overbearing. It's now the case that HMRC, the tax authorities, have got the power to take money from your bank account before they've even told you why. And you are guilty of dodging your taxes until you've proved yourself innocent. That's near fascism.
Okay. Let's get back to the 300 million people in China who've been brought out of poverty in the last 25 or 30 years. The fact is that was essentially through economic growth. It was nothing whatever to do with redistribution. If you want the poor to be better off, get more economic growth is the answer. That's the gentleman said.
No, that's not it. That's not it.
That's all you have to do.
No, it's not just.
That is the story of the 300 million people in China who you don't want to talk about. And by the way, if you talk about relative poverty, I think the Bible says something about that. Relative poverty, of course, is always with us. Because suppose overnight one could snap one's fingers and have absolute equality all over the planet. What would happen on day 2? Some people would have earned more than other people in a functioning economy. Some people would have saved more than other people, and some people would be older than other people. 3 separate reasons why the amount of wealth, if you compare that for every person in the economy, is bound to be different. What are you going to do? Are you going to have more aggressive redistribution every 24 hours to keep this absolute equality? Of course not.
So this is getting silly because none of us
will not be practical.
None of us have argued for absolute equality.
And none of us have argued for no redistribution. None of us have argued for no redistribution.
I'm not accusing you of
We've
doing
argued
that.
against aggressive redistribution.
I have not accused you guys. I'm glad you accept the need for redistribution.
Of course.
We don't argue, we're not arguing for equality, and some of us accept that some inequality is a necessary condition of growth.
Does Mr. Corbyn agree with that?
Some inequality is a necessary condition of growth, that's certainly my view. The issue is, are current levels of wealth inequality necessary for that, right? And if they're not, then some redistribution, right, is going to be compatible with the growth that is needed. So the world is full and society is full, and it's a very good point that we need to be clear about whether we're talking about societies or the world. And some of you may not like the true implications of some of our arguments about the global inequality when you realise that most people in the UK are very wealthy, right, in the world as a whole. So we have to be really careful. And I think that was a really important point for people to be clear about. But we are not arguing that inequality is not necessary for growth, at least I'm not. The question is, are current levels of inequality helpful, even in the long run, to the well-being of the worst off amongst us, right? And I don't believe that they are. And therefore some redistribution from existing levels of inequality, some substantial, radical, aggressive, whatever word you want to use, is justified because the existing levels cannot be defended on the grounds that they're helping the worst off, even in the long run. That's our view.
I mean, I've got a question actually. This is a genuine question for the other side. Are you concerned or talking mainly about inequality of wealth or inequality of income? Because I think in a lot of the discussion and the debate we have in this country, and I suspect amongst the audience here, those two things are conflated and they're actually quite different. So which is it that you're actually talking about?
Well, I took it that my arguments applied to both, but it's inequalities of wealth that are the ones that are kind of the ones that should primarily be concerned about. Yeah, wealth is the one on the top.
Okay, moving on. Next question. Ed.
Okay, so it seems to me this is a deeply practical question. Economics should be. I mean, you know, even Marxism could potentially work in theory, I guess. So with that in mind, what policies do the government speakers imagine being implemented to make this happen? As in, how do they imagine money travelling from the pocket of a banker or the bank account of a banker to a farm in sub-Saharan Africa? Who is taking that money? Who is spending it? And like, what is the legitimacy of all those organisations in the meantime?
The problem is the money is actually going the other way. It's not travelling from the banks of London to farmers in sub-Saharan Africa. It's travelling from sub-Saharan Africa to the banks in Frankfurt, London, New York, and so on, because that is the way the world's trading system operates, which deliberately underprices the products at the point of production on the farms, and then overprices them at the point of actual sale in the Western economy. So we have to look at trade, and I notice over there Nick has kindly brought some transatlantic trade and investment partnership information. This is a big horror coming down the road, which is going to be incredibly damaging to public services all over Europe, because we're going to reduce the lowest level of the worst state in the USA. One thing I would say to the others that have put a contrary argument this evening, I love the irony of these debates. These are people extolling the virtues of Chinese economic growth. Last time I looked, it was called the People's Republic of China, and it's dominated by a one-party state with a Communist Party running it. Now, I have many problems with the way China has developed, many problems with its environmental disasters, and a lot of the lack of liberties that people have there. But the economic growth that they're extolling has actually come through a combination of very tight state control on behaviour and an unbelievably lax attitude towards exploitation, refoulement of investment, and working conditions of people that are exploited within China. That is not the kind of redistribution I want. I want redistribution that actually is fair towards people. The last point to make on this, since we're talking about wages, yes, there has been a movement of manufacturing capability away from the USA and Europe towards China. What we have at the moment, because of a lack of an effective international labour organisation and the lack of a trade agreement that is at all fair, is a beggar thy neighbour policy where clothing companies move from one low-wage economy to another, to another, to another, with an awful lot of people suffering the most appalling privations along the way. Surely there has to be an element of control. There has to be an element of international control and international agreement. The free market is a brutal thing, and the free market ends up with the richest and most powerful becoming even richer and even more powerful, and the dispossessed becoming less powerful and more dispossessed. And so we do have the technology, we do have the ability, we do have the resources in the world to share things out more equally. They're not getting shared more equally, they're getting shared more unequally. And that surely in the 21st century we can do a bit better than that.
Yes, but it would be nice if you could answer the question is, how do you propose practically to implement your proposal of aggressive global redistribution of wealth? How will you actually do it in practice? Well, not just have redistribution that is fair. I mean, that's a pathetic answer.
Incredibly aggressive. It's a civilized debate at a university.
Could you answer the question then?
I'll help you. But I think that possibly whether this be intent is what I was saying, so I'll help you. I was talking about the need for more effective international regulation. Firstly, through the International Labour Organization, to protect labour standards and rights of assembly and rights of trade union membership. I'm sure even you would agree that organised workers tend to be better paid and better employed than unorganised workers. And secondly, that instead of developing a trade organisation around the world that relies entirely on unregulated free trade, instead we have the sort of trade organisation on principles that maybe the Andean-Pact countries are trying to do, which is where you promote trade between nations at the same time as they're redistributing wealth and eliminating poverty. And that's the interesting example, a very small country may be, of what Bolivia has achieved over the past 10 years, from being one of the poorest countries in Latin America to one, it's not the richest, there isn't massive wealth in Bolivia, but it's certainly a lot better off. And quite interestingly, its president has now been re-elected for the third time on a very fair election
with increased votes all the time. Most governments lose support in office, they've gained support in office, so they must be doing something right. So there are ways of doing things. Here in Warwick, even Warwick, we can't solve all the world's problems, but I think we can go some way towards it by at least thinking of the possibility of using institutions more effectively to control the excesses of free market capitalism and have an aspiration of a fairer distribution of wealth and resources around the world.
I agree with a lot of what Jeremy said about the world trade system. The WTO is a deeply corrupt organisation dominated by the so-called Quad. That's the EU, US, Canada and Japan. The fact that the developing countries, the emerging markets, have rebelled against that, kicked against that. Firstly in Cancun. I mean, even my friends in the World Development Movement will acknowledge I was probably the mainstream journalist who did more to cover that than anyone else. I absolutely applaud that process. The reality is the WTO as it's currently constituted is deeply unfair because it's rigged, because it's not free market enough in many ways. It's not a free market when the West pushes everyone around and tells them what to do. You can't denigrate free markets. The reality is, despite what Jeremy says, and I've watched him in the Commons for many, many years, I'm very happy as a taxpayer to fund him because he does put forward interesting and useful arguments. But the reality is, inequality across the world, for all Mr. Piketty's arguments about the 1%, inequality across the world has fallen enormously, largely because of economic growth and free markets that's happened despite governments getting in the way. Despite governments getting in the way. The answer to reducing inequality isn't more government. The answer to reducing inequality is allowing people within the law, within regulation, within a framework of morals and ethics, which is vital, which is what civil society is there for, which I support, to build businesses, to meet the needs of consumers, to employ people, to spread opportunities. The problem in this country in particular is actually a lack of social mobility. That's what I said. So campaign against a lack of social mobility. Smash vested interest up. Complain about them. Don't complain. Don't campaign for a policy that's all about the politics of envy and denigrating people for the success that they've had. And those 1%, they don't pay their taxes because they've all got clever accountants, often with politicians allowing them to get away with it in return for a nice campaign donation. These kind of wealth taxes, so-called, are going to hit people like you, people who have come to university. Often you'll be the first.
Because what you're conflating is having your agency and your range of choices constrained by circumstances and conditions, and having it constrained by somebody else's will. Now, I think the two things are completely different. It's a mistake to conflate them. It is certainly the case that people who have less wealth, less income, maybe other things like less natural ability or disability, have their agency constrained. And I do actually think that, it's a good thing to increase people's agency. But that's not the same thing as saying that they are coerced. For me, coercion means being subject to somebody else's will through some mechanism such as the use or threat of force. That's what coercion means to me. And I think it's actually not helpful to the clarity of arguments to try and say that something like material conditions or the economic structure of society or pre-existing disadvantages you may have because of things that you can't control, like your gender or something, is the same thing as coercion. It's something else. And that actually, I think, obscures clear thinking about what to do about lack of agency if you start to conflate that with not just coercion. So I don't think the two things are the same. Now, the other point you make is this. The point is, it's a voluntary transaction. It's not so much that there's a consent. I'm not arguing for a consent-based thing here. As you rightly say, that's a nonsensical argument, because nobody goes to a chap in a bar in, Dubai or something and says, well, do you consent to indirectly transfer part of your income to Wayne Rooney? That clearly is the case. What I'm saying is that the transactions at every stage of that process are voluntary transactions. People are not forced or compelled to take out subscriptions to Star TV or whatever Rupert Murdoch's local company is called to watch the Premier League. They voluntarily pay to do that. In turn, the Sky voluntarily pays the Premier League a large amount of money, and Manchester United, in their infinite wisdom, voluntarily pay a large amount to Wayne Rooney. Now, my point, therefore, is that there's no element of forced compliance at that stage, at any stage of that process. And if you object to that, if you think that it's wrong that somebody who has benefited from that kind of set of actions should gain such a disproportionately large income, you think, then you've got to be prepared to say that the political process should interfere with people's free use and disposal of their income, their time, their effort and the like. Now, as you probably know, this is not an original argument with me, this is basically Robert Nozick's argument from the Will Chamberlain example from the second part of Anarchy, State Utopia, but I think it's a correct argument in this case.
Versus Whitman.
Oh gosh.
He agrees. Yay!
So this distinction between being constrained by one's conditions and being constrained by other people's will, that was one of the points I tried to address when I was giving my little talk. If you're poor and you try and go into a shop and get something and you don't have the money, what you're constrained by is other people's will, right? Their unwillingness to give you the thing that you want. So what property laws do, and what property rights do, is protect the freedom of those who have the property, and they constrain the freedom of those who don't. And it's an act of will by the policeman, by us, and authorising the policeman to enforce the property laws. Okay, so it just doesn't work. There is an interference with the freedom of movement or the freedom to take the stuff. Right? Now, that might be right. It might be right that we stop the poor guy who's got no money taking the stuff, but it's not because we're not interfering with his freedom. Right? We are interfering with his freedom. We need a separate claim about who owns the stuff, and we need a theory of property rights that explains why it's okay to stop some people doing things and okay to allow other people to do those same things. Yeah. So I totally agree with the question, and I just don't think this distinction between condition and willful constraint, constraint by other people's will, it doesn't stand up.
Just to say, Adam seems to be arguing against, should we all go and live on a kibbutz? You have a capitalist society. There are many rough edges to capitalism. As Churchill said, it's the worst possible form of government, except for all the other forms.
Except democracy.
The point is, we do have massive redistribution. The chap who's poor, who goes into a shop to buy something from somebody who has spent their money producing that thing or buying that thing from somebody else, if he doesn't have any money, to a certain degree, and we spend about 1/3 of our entire national income on this in this country, can get recourse from the state. And that's absolutely right. Nobody on this side is arguing for some kind of stripped down Hayekian state. We're arguing, well, I'm certainly arguing for a state which is about 30 to 35% of GDP, where there is recourse for people who are in serious need or between jobs or sick or infirm and all the rest of it. But at the moment, the state is 50% of GDP, and the revenue we're receiving is only 45% of GDP, which is building up. The politicians don't want to talk about it. They talk about the deficit, the annual increase in the debt. They don't talk about the debt itself. The debt is heading towards your generation in a very, very big way, and I want to focus attention on that. There's already enough redistribution. We just need to do it in terms of size. We just need to do it much better by making the state more efficient.
Right, thank you. I think we have time for one last question. Miguel.
First of all, I'll just say it's important not to conflate government spending with debt. The issue I'd like to focus on is on the issue of talents and whether we are.
I don't understand. What do you mean by that?
Not all the things the government does is redistribution. You can argue that the government spends all the money, taxes on redistribution. That's simply not true.
It's about 30% of the 45% of government spending is welfare payments. About 30% out of 45%.
And most of that is pensions that people have paid into. But now, if you allow me to go into the question I was intending to ask about talents, you've argued that we're not allowed to tax or take the value of those talents. there's two issues here, because one of them is that talents are enabled by the society we live in, by the roads, by education, all these things, and we need to share those in common, and we need to share the value of our talent, which was attained in common, also in common. So that's why we need a lot more redistribution than right now. But also, are you claiming that talents are so disparate that some people deserve to earn £2 an hour, as people in this university do, and others deserve to earn thousands, several thousands an hour? Are talents so disparate when, for the same minute, people are producing that disparate amounts? It's just not plausible. It's, somebody in this university can produce thousands a minute, while an hour, while others produce only £2. Just untrue.
Okay. First of all, I actually accept your first point, that it's not just a matter of individuals having talent. The use that you can make of those talents is to some extent only possible because of what you might call collective assets, institutions of one kind or another. That does not necessarily lead to an argument for redistribution. It does lead to an argument for making contributions to a kind of common pot which will provide them. And as you rightly said, government spending is not all redistributive. But the point is, that argument that you have benefited from these common resources and common structures, if you will, like the legal system, for instance, doesn't logically or necessarily entail redistribution. What it entails only necessarily is that you should have to make some kind of contribution towards the maintenance of those common things. That's a different argument, which I accept. Now, as to the other one, well, there's 2 points here. One is that, yes, in many cases, there is such a huge disproportion of talent. Plus, it's worth saying, there's a technical point here, many kinds of occupation for various reasons have what we call a winner-takes-all income distribution. That's to say that things like professional sport, entertainment, law, accountancy, actually, David can tell you, these are all professions or occupations which typically you find that about 1 or 2% of the people who are engaged in it get about 50 to 60% of the total income pool that profession has. This is because they're non-scalable. It's an inevitable feature of that kind of occupation. Now, how is that related to talent? It is partly, but not completely. What you find is that you do need talent, and even more importantly, application, qualities of character, to get into that top 1%. But you also need a large amount of luck, which is why I am a Hayekian, as Greg explained. But the point is that therefore, there is a connection. Now, sometimes the disparities, for example, I don't myself believe that chief executive officers in this country are in many cases worth the kind of salaries they're getting paid. Because if you look at the gap, the difference between their level of pay now and what it was 30 years ago, it's gone up enormously. And it's quite clear their productivity has not gone up by anything like the same amount. That is clearly a case where, in fact, the rewards are due to other things. You have a serious principal agent problem in large public companies. That's what the evidence suggests. The answer is to address that and to change the way that company law and remuneration works, not to go in for taking money off them and then redistributing it around further.
Anyone on proposition wishing to respond? Right, let's move on to concluding speech.
Neither of those things is true, and that if you are indeed, I think rightly, alarmed by the way in which some people have wealth which you would say is ill-gotten or inappropriate, the solution is not to take money away from them and everybody else, including people who have acquired the wealth perfectly appropriately. It's rather to address the reasons why some people have got wealth that they are not correctly entitled to, such as political cronyism and the like. I'm glad, by the way, that the kind of regime Jeremy was talking about, which I'm sure I know he's very sincere in advocating, is actually a recipe for political cronyism and capture of the process by the already wealthy, which is what is already done. I only wish we did have unregulated free trade. There'd be a lot more wealth and a lot less inequality if we did.
Okay, 2 points. First of all, just to go back to my first point, aggressive redistribution of wealth is happening, and it's happening every day in our society. Since the financial crisis, 95% of all income gains made in the United States went to the 1%. Virtually everything, virtually all the income gains made in the United States went to the 1%. That is aggressive redistribution of wealth. Sometimes it happens in direct payments, sometimes it happens in, when you pay your university fees to the financiers. But sometimes it happens simply through exploitation. It simply happens because some people are not paid what they deserve to be paid for doing their job. And that's the whole project of globalisation. The whole project of globalisation is based around that idea of a race to the bottom in terms of wages and conditions. That exploitation is why there is massive redistribution. Secondly, it can happen. There's many practical ways it can happen, and Jeremy isn't arguing for cronyism and corruption. I believe what he's arguing for, certainly what I'm arguing for, is actually the kind of outpouring of democracy we've seen in countries in Latin America. And the kind of policies that they put in place are absolutely not all to do with tax. I think tax plays a role, but it isn't just about tax. You redistribute in many different ways. First of all, we need to definancialise our economy. We need to remove power from the financial sector so we don't live in an economy dependent on interest and rent. We need to impose capital control so that countries can have control of their own money supply again, can regain their sovereignty. We need to have co-ops so that we're not and support small businesses too, and small farmers, so that we're not completely run by big corporations that clearly the world is run by at the moment. This is happening. Trade agreements based on different principles and so on. It's happening in Latin America now, and there is redistribution in the right direction in that part of the world as a result of those policies, not as a result of free market policies. And it can happen here too, if we want it to happen and we fight for it.
Yes, well, I shall try to be moderate because Mr. Corbyn accused me of being aggressive, which is somewhat cheeky when you think of the wording of the resolution. He is the one calling for aggression on the You're arguing for it. I mentioned the Industrial Revolution. I forgot to make a point in our very strict limitation of time, which is not only since the Industrial Revolution has the average income in this country gone up about 10 times in real terms. That's a sensational rate of increase. Just think for a moment what happened before the Industrial Revolution. Population would grow very, very slowly, and economic growth would be very, very slow. And if economic growth got a little bit faster, there would be more people, and the standard of living would go straight back to subsistence level. And that's why the classical economists argue we could never get out of that trap. And that's why economics was called, in those days, the dismal science. It's not the dismal science anymore, because we know much more now about how to create economic growth. Yes, we can have arguments about how that economic growth is spread. And of course, this isn't a perfect world. But I can see a lot of shrewd faces in the audience here, and you will have noticed the almost complete lack of any practical way that we could carry out this aggressive redistribution of wealth and help the poor. We say, do things, particularly on the supply side, to help increase economic growth, which will, if history is any guide, in time come to help all of us, the poor as well as the rich. So we have not only the better argument, but we have a practical proposition that would actually work. That is alien to our opponents.
Yeah, so this is really interesting because I'm also struck by the amount of agreement there is. I don't know whether my colleagues. So I think we all think that existing inequalities are not justified. But I think we have different grounds for that. There might be corruption in the World Trade Organization. It might be failures of regulation in the financial industry in the domestic case. Right. So, but I think none of us are defending the current scale of inequality.
We had limited time.
Right, okay, well, so Middleton would have defended even existing levels of inequality. So he's welcome to try to. So I think that it is really interesting. And secondly, it depends what you mean. So when I endorse the aggressive redistribution of wealth, what I take myself to be doing is endorsing a radically different distribution of wealth, grounded in fairness, in liberty, or in self-ownership type claims as well. But most of the work has been done by these incentive type practical arguments. And I think it's just interesting that we should be thinking about other ways of organizing domestic and the global economy. And I agree, it's a big challenge. I don't have any answer about how to do it. I'm just pointing out that very different distributions of wealth would be justified if we could achieve them. And on that grounds, I support the aggressive, radical, substantial redistribution of
coming. Thank you. I think there's obviously two separate debates going on here. There's the global debate, and then there's the debate in the Western world. I've directed my comments mainly towards the debate in the Western world, but just briefly, inequality across the world as a whole has fallen rapidly since I left the University of Warwick in 1991. The reason it's fallen rapidly isn't because of more government, it's because of less government. China is growing quickly. Yes, China has an almost totalitarian political regime, but as a percentage of GDP, government spending is lower than it is in many Western countries. China's growing very quickly. There has been some state involvement, but also because of massive unleashing of entrepreneurial culture, with people leaving rather primitive existences in agricultural contexts, going to cities and bettering themselves, creating money for themselves, for their families and their children. Across the world, I totally agree that the trading system is corrupt. Here in the Western world, I totally agree that the bankers have got away with a huge amount of things. That means fix the cronyist, almost neo-colonial trading system, which I think is the word you two would agree with. Here in the West, fix the banking system, face up to the vested interests. It's a very naive assumption, ladies and gentlemen, especially when you're on the cusp of adulthood, if I may say so, to think that more government means a better society. More government doesn't necessarily mean a better society. Throughout history, there have been examples of governments trying to impose their will on societies, becoming overbearing, becoming totalitarian. We're now in a situation in the Western world, ladies and gentlemen, where Western governments, for the most part, are bankrupt. Our markets for sovereign debt are only being propped up by printed money. In this country, the Bank of England owns a third of all outstanding debt. We need to rein in our government. We need to live within our means. We need to be grown up and adult about it. And that means getting government under control. If you support an aggressive redistribution of wealth, ladies and gentlemen, you support letting rip, taxing success, the politics of envy, and a government that could become a major source of instability rather than a major source of stability. Vote against the motion.
First of all, thank you very much for having the debate and seriously debating and discussing the subject. That is very welcome. I think there's a philosophy here. Do we want to aspire to inequality and unfairness, or do we want to aspire to an equality of opportunity and sharing of resources for everybody? On this side, we have brought in the global arguments a great deal because we live in a globalised economy. The British economy is as globalised as any other, and we rely very heavily on what happens elsewhere in the world. Therefore, I do take seriously the issues of poverty in other countries. I do take seriously the issue of exploitation of garment workers in Bangladesh or Indonesia or anywhere else, or in China for that matter. But I also take very seriously the unfairness of environmental regulations, which I support tough environmental regulations such as we have in a lot of Europe on emission controls, pollution, water pollution, air pollution. They're not tough enough in many ways. But by not insisting on the same level of regulation in developing economies where there is a huge investment coming from Western capital, we're actually allowing that Western capital to make a great deal more money out of low wages and pollution, which is what they're doing in China at the present time. And so that's why, when you argue that get government off our backs and less government will bring about a more fair world, I don't actually agree with you there. I think that in a good sense, government can produce good health services, can produce good education, can produce good environmental protection, and can protect the poorest and most vulnerable against the grossest forms of exploitation. So to me, it is a question partly about taxation, but it's also about the glaring inequalities of wealth. Carlos Slim, you're quite right to draw attention to it, the world's richest man, lives and owns a large amount of Mexico, which is one of the most divided countries in the world, rich to poor, probably the most divided, actually. I mean, it's sort of miserable competition for that title. And so I would actually want to take a great deal of wealth off Carlos Slim. And I have to say this, an awful lot of people I've met in Mexico, my wife's from Mexico, and know it quite well, a lot of people would agree with me, they want to take a great deal off him. And also, all these people that are sort of running around the world putting their money into tax havens, let's close off the tax havens, let's close off the fiddling of taxes by the world's global corporation. That would be a step towards redistribution of wealth. That would be a step towards putting money into health, into housing, into education, rather than into luxury goods and tax havens and all the fiddling that goes with it. Please, show Warwick what it's made of. And for the motion. Thank you very much.
So we're going to do a quick vote now on the motion. Who wishes to propose? Abstentions? All right, a few. On the motion that this House supports the aggressive redistribution of wealth, the motion passes. Apologies. I'm very thin. The motion fails. On the 27th of November, we will have representatives from all the major British political parties, so please put